Thank you very much for the introduction, Melinda. It was so lovely to be here in my home state after a week of Parliament. Can I too begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation on the land of which we gather. Can I particularly acknowledge Uncle Shane and thank him for his incredibly heartfelt welcome and the spirit in which it is given. All of us attend multiple conferences, and in our workplaces we have welcomes to country as part of our reconciliation action plans in our workplaces. But I think it's really important to reflect on the why. Why do we do that? It's incredibly, it's about manners, it's about respect, it's about understanding of country. And we have this incredible gift in this country that we are, I guess, the custodians of the oldest culture in the planet. And I think you hear from Uncle Shane just what that means to us as a nation. In paying my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, I extend those to all First Nations peoples who are here with us today. When I look back on this year, I hope very much that we will remember this as a milestone on our nation's long journey towards reconciliation. I'm proud to be a member of a government that supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. We now have the question that you will all be asked. We all have one vote, one decision to make. I'll be voting yes, and I'll be encouraging as many people as I possibly can to do so as well. Can I also acknowledge that today I've just had breakfast with her, but you'll see her a little bit later, the Honourable Jacinta Allan, Deputy Premier of Victoria, to Diane Smith, your National Chair, to Melinda, your CEO, but also to Gabrielle Traynor, the Interim Chair of Infrastructure Australia. I am really delighted to be here to address the 2023 Infrastructure Conference. As many of you may recall, I joined you as the Shadow Minister at last year's CEDA Infrastructure Conference. And back then, the question that we were discussing was whether Australia's big infrastructure build is delivering value. The answer I settled on was simple and perhaps predictable from opposition was no. Back in early 2022, I said that Australia needs a government that listens to expert advice, works cooperatively, invests strategically and puts equity at the heart of its plan. The Australian people seem to have felt the same. Since coming to government, we've moved purposefully to implement our election commitments. We are streamlining the infrastructure investment pipeline and we have more work to do. We're refocusing on the projects that increase productivity, grow resilience and deliver significant social benefits to communities. We're working cooperatively with our state and territory colleagues to ensure that we can manage the very real constraints that exist in the market today. We're doing all of this because I know what responsible investment in infrastructure can do. It can expand the productive capacity of the economy. It can improve the resilience of supply chains for freight and trade. It can ease congestion and contribute to safer, better connected communities so people can go where they need to be, making our cities and regions more livable. And it can enable indirect benefits, such as through local procurement and increased workforce participation by women and our First Nations peoples. It's why I'm pleased to see that the theme for today's or this year's event is delivering infrastructure, delivering social and economic value. I don't think I could have come up with a better theme of where we are with infrastructure today. So let's start, of course, first with the economic value of infrastructure investment. In 2021-22, 8.9% of Australia's GDP was from infrastructure industries, and in the 12 months to October 2022, $36.4 billion was spent on transport infrastructure construction across Australia. Infrastructure industries employ thousands of Australians, from the very biggest projects like Melbourne Metro and the Suburban Rail Loop here in Victoria, through to local road upgrades in every city, every region and every remote area in the country. Across the nation, 190,000 workers are building our future on public infrastructure projects alone. These workers are, of course, earning good wages, which they use to support their families, raise their children and to support local businesses. I think the economic value in that direct employment stands up pretty strongly on its own. And that's before we even get to the productivity benefits that good infrastructure investment brings. Good investments in rail and road and intermodal facilities get our goods to market faster. They keep our trucks moving, they connect businesses with each other, and they get us to and from work sooner or safer. It makes our economy more productive and more resilient, and later today Minister Allen and I will be signing a Memorandum of Understanding on rail interoperability. That might sound a bit niche, but we are signing these across Australia to lock in standards on rule books, on safe work arrangements, trains and signalling systems, the diversity of which impedes productivity and makes travelling across rail networks costlier with added safety risks. Improving rail interoperability will allow for passengers and freight to move more seamlessly and safely between our major cities, regions and ports on a modern, integrated and productive rail network that works as one interoperable system. We hope that it will create jobs and grow the economy, particularly in rail freight. But while we often spend a lot of time talking about the economic benefits of infrastructure, I am glad that the topic today also gives us a chance to talk about the other part of the equation, the social benefits. As Minister, I am determined that we put more focus on the second half. Of course, social benefits can be closely linked to the economic benefits, particularly when you consider well-paid jobs and proposals like our Australian Skills Guarantee that will mean that 10% of workers on Commonwealth-funded major projects will be an apprentice, trainee or paid cadet. But there is also the social benefits of spreading opportunity to regions that are underserved or disadvantaged. You can see this in remote Australia with projects like the sealing of the Tanami. In the October budget, the Albanese government committed $740 million towards the Central Australian project. Sealing this road will improve safety, connectivity, flood resilience and social and economic development of the region. It will let people reach opportunities in regional areas like Alice Springs, and it will let opportunities spread to remote communities across Central Australia. And in the same way that you can see the powerful impact that major projects like Suburban Rail Loop will have on this city and this state. This rail line will change the way we interact with Melbourne, allowing us to access jobs, schools, universities, medical facilities and economic precincts that were previously out of reach. It will change the way regional Victorians interact with the city too, particularly from those from the east, but those from the west like me as well. It will create new employment, education, residential and retail precincts, help growing Melbourne into a major world city for generations to come. I'm happy to see Jacinta Allen will be here today, and I know that she is just as excited about the potential of this project as I am. These are just two examples of projects creating social dividends, but you can see more across the country, from local projects improving the livability of a town through to the largest reshaping a state. But to achieve both good economic and good social outcomes, it is essential that our investments are well considered and well targeted. As many here know, I've spoken at length about our reforms to Infrastructure Australia, and I'm sure I'll get a further opportunity to do so throughout our discussion, and I've introduced legislation to reform Infrastructure Australia into the Parliament this week. But Infrastructure Australia isn't the only way through which we will be better targeting our infrastructure spending from the Commonwealth's level. I've spoken less regularly about my plans to issue an infrastructure policy statement for land transport, but really it's no less important. The statement will do two things. Firstly, it will clearly define the Australian Government's land transport investment role as a leader in nation-building infrastructure. The role of the Australian Government in infrastructure investment has become blurred and ill-defined, and I'm determined that that will change. Secondly, it will identify the principles and objectives that underpin our future investments in transport projects and will help guide Infrastructure Australia's advice to government. This policy statement is still being finalised, but the Commonwealth should be focused on projects that increase productivity, build resilience of our freight networks, advance our net zero cause, and lead to safer, better connected cities and regions. This statement is important because, frankly, after 10 years of the previous government, we do need a reset. In 2012-2013, when we left office, there were 146 projects on the Infrastructure Investment Program. They were nation-building projects. By the time the Coalition left office in 21-22, there were 873 projects in the Infrastructure Investment Pipeline, 705 of these below $100 million. These projects included culverts on a local council road in outback Queensland, and repainting the surface of bike lanes in Perth from black to red. Given the market constraints we face, getting Australians' infrastructure agenda back onto a sustainable footing is more important than ever. In September this year, our workforce shortfall is due to peak at about 112,000 workers. This shortage is particularly felt amongst engineers, surveyors, project managers and labourers, amongst many others. It's being felt across the country in every state and territory, and everywhere it's being combined with rising costs, of course, in construction materials. It's why we need to choose what we build carefully, and I am thankful to my colleagues in the states and territories for working collaboratively with me to better align project funding with delivery timelines and to refocus on projects that will deliver the bigger benefit. Of course, our initiatives like Jobs and Skills Australia and Fee-Free TAFE will help tackle these shortages over the medium term, but in the immediate future we've had to take some tough decisions about what not to build and what projects to prioritise. When it comes on focusing on the projects that matter the most, we have to talk about resilience. Any of you who've turned into my press club speech recently would have already heard me talk about the visit I made to Fitzroy Crossing last month. The loss of one bridge and the way it has split that community from vital supply lines is a stark reminder of how important it is to maintain and build our essential freight routes and build in redundancy. Yes, we will, along with the Western Australia Government, rebuild the bridge and rebuild it back better than the 1970s bridge that was there previously. But we should all reflect on the fact that while this time the damage might be felt in Fitzroy Crossing, there are many places in Australia that are just as vulnerable. It's with that in mind that the Bureau of Infrastructure and Transport Research Economics in my portfolio is carrying out the Road and Rail Supply Chain Resilience Review. Phase 1 of the report, identifying the risk, was released earlier this year, and I encourage those who are interested to read it. The report paints a pretty stark picture of our vulnerabilities. The Transcontinental Rail Line, Stewart Highway, Carpentaria Highway, South Coast Highway in Western Australia, and the main West Rail Line out of Sydney, just to name a few. All are vital transport links and all are rated in this report as at high risk. In phase 2 of the review, my department will develop options for strengthening the resilience of road and rail networks in consultation with stakeholders and other levels of government. Then we'll come to the hard part, rebuilding and repairing our freight and supply networks so that they are ready to stand long into the future. It's a task that all of us in states, territories and the Commonwealth must confront over the years to come. Before I'd finish, I'd also like to just return briefly to the issue of labour shortages. At the end of January, Melinda was all over the news speaking about the gender divide in critical industries such as construction, citing statistics that show the percentage of women in construction has worsened over the past quarter century in CEDA's submission to the Employment White Paper. That gender divide concerns me greatly. We now have a female Commonwealth Minister for Infrastructure alongside female infrastructure ministers here in Victoria, in WA and in the Northern Territory. But it is time we had a lot more women in hard hats. I'm pleased to say that the Albanese government has already moved in 2 areas which CEDA advocates as important to addressing this problem. They are more and more flexible paid parental leave, with legislation introduced in November and passing the Parliament, as well as increased access to affordable, high-quality childcare. The Cheaper Childcare Bill again passed the Parliament in November, and it is now law, and in, I think it is now 99 days, will become a reality. Taken together, these reforms seek to address a key structural barrier which is currently preventing women from participating in the workforce or working as much as they are able. It took a majority female government to deliver them, and there's lots more to come. Thank you so much for having me here this morning.
big challenges? What do you see as the big opportunities? Because last time you talked a lot about the need for guiding principles and values to set the frame for work. How do you think you're going on that?
Yeah, well, it's a big task. I'm sorry, I have to use a mic. I want to address today, but it doesn't lend itself to flicking mics onto them. It's been an incredible 10 months, and I think there's been a lot to do. There's been a lot to sort of reset the architecture in which Commonwealth investments are made. We obviously had a budget within a pretty short period of time that gave us an opportunity to have a first look at where the Commonwealth had been investing in infrastructure, talk to states and territories, really reset that relationship. It's always, you know, a constructive but tense working relationship between states and territories, and you know, it's been so lovely to actually have those relationships with the infrastructure and transport ministers in every state and territory and work through that pipeline, understand where the constraints are, understand where their constraints are, and really try and develop that. But we've still got a lot to do. I think, as I said, you know, the infrastructure investment pipeline now sits with around 734 different projects, many of them that are very short on funding and even shorter now. Some have been sitting on the books for quite a long period of time. So there's a lot of work to do. But I think for me, I think it has been just such an incredible opportunity. There is such power in being able to make these decisions that make a really substantial long-term difference to the future of the nation. So it's been good fun, but it's been hard work. Yeah. Yeah, I think we've sort of had to sort of look at, we're going well in the sense that it's abundantly clear, you know, you would have noticed that this government's got probably a bit of a different view on climate change than the previous one, and there's a real focus on achieving decarbonisation, particularly of the transport industry, but also recognising that infrastructure actually has a really significant role to play in that. It's not just about trucks on roads or getting more electric vehicles or changing the regulatory settings around those. It's actually about the built environment as well, and how we actually can embed good decarbonisation principles into that as well. I think being able to really think about what is the importance of the Commonwealth, what is it fund, and I think, as I said in the speech, you know, that has become quite blurred. If you look at, you know, some of the projects in the infrastructure investment program, you'd have to say, is that where you think the Commonwealth should be investing money? It's not to say that they're not important projects in small or local communities, but is that where you want your Commonwealth taxpayer money to actually go? What are the problems that we've got around the, you know, productivity, around flood resilience, around moving freight around the country? How do we actually go about those big nation building tasks? So we're getting there, and we'll have more to say in the infrastructure investment policy statement.
Okay, so maybe we can move on to infrastructure.
Yep. Well, I've got Gabrielle, my interim chair here, so I'm sure Gabrielle, I'm not sure if you're speaking, Gabrielle, but she'll talk a little bit about that as well. Look, I think the interesting thing, I think, when you talk to people about when Infrastructure Australia was set up, really what we wanted from it was it to provide the Commonwealth for independent advice about investment. So I get states and territories coming to me with billions and billions of dollars of requests. I get initiated projects from property developers and all sorts of things, all saying, you know, you have to invest in this particular project. And it's really hard to judge, well, what is, you know, there's not an unlimited bucket. What do you actually where do you put your money? How is it actually going to help productivity, help livability? How is it, you know, what is it going to do? And so my department will go through those. I've got terrific people in the public sector, but really IA was meant to do that. So on transport infrastructure, but on energy infrastructure, water infrastructure and telecommunications infrastructure. And that was its role. There weren't state bodies at the time either, so the states and territories would draw on its expertise as well. 10 years along, we've got, again, if you look at the growth in the infrastructure pipeline, it won't surprise people that it sort of grew a lot in 2016 and 2019. There were elections in both of those years, and the sort of under 50 projects really shot up in that period of time, particularly in certain areas of the country. And so it really got ignored. And I think what Infrastructure Australia then tried to do was, well, okay, if our major client, the Commonwealth's not listening to us, where else are we going to go? So you started to see it really focus on like local governments, and there's a local government in the country who won't come to me and say, right, I've gone to Infrastructure Australia, we've invested money in getting a business case for this project, it's now on the priority list, that means it's going to be funded, isn't it? And so that there's an assumption that it's on the list and Infrastructure Australia is going to give it money. So that's what's happened. I think it's really fragmented. So what I've done in the legislation is really focus IA back on being the Commonwealth's independent advisor on nationally significant infrastructure projects. For the first time, I was incredibly surprised, certainly for the first time in a decade, I've actually asked Infrastructure Australia to look at the budget bids the states are putting in. I'm trying to embed their advice into the budget decision-making process. We're still to get there, we've got a way to go yet, but that's what's happening for the first time, and hopefully the legislation gets through Parliament so I can tighten up, really, the focus of it on providing that Commonwealth advice.
You've already talked a number of times about this interplay between federal and state, and that's clearly something that, you know, really every infrastructure project that's of any great note is going to require some coordination there. And we have a question that's come through from the audience around Inland Rail, but with a particular focus, saying that unfortunately the line ends about 20 kilometres short of the Port of Brisbane. Kerry, is that right? With road transport filling the gap. I think I'm getting a nod, maybe. And what role can government play in solving this sort of thing? So maybe we don't need to necessarily talk about exactly the Port of Brisbane, but more the overall concept of how federal and state government can collaborate better.
Yeah, falls a bit short of the Port of Melbourne as well, so it's sort of truly inland at the moment. Kerry's here, and I should acknowledge Kerry has done an amazing, really hard job on undertaking a very detailed review for the incoming government on Inland Rail. We will release that shortly. We're just, it's a really big project, and the report has clearly identified some very, very significant problems with this project from the governance, project management, right the way through to the project itself. So we'll have more to say about that in itself. That cooperative relationship is really important. You know, we are at the federal government. We are co-investors in nation-building infrastructure. We want to help. You know, we want to drive states to look at productivity. We want to partner with them on those projects. And they, of course, then are the body that tenders and funds funds their share and then delivers those projects. There are outcomes that we want to get out of infrastructure, which is not just about productivity, but it's about, you know, training more Australian kids, trying to deal with that workforce capacity. We want to see how infrastructure can contribute to net zero, and of course we want to make sure that our suburbs, regions and cities are as livable for our people as possible. So really that relationship's incredibly important, but of course it's also difficult. You know, we all face incredible budgetary constraints at the moment. We've been left with a budget in significant debt. We've got really big scale projects like, you might have heard the Prime Minister talk about there's been no funding provision for the My Health record, no funding provision for MyGov going forward from the previous budget, so previous government. So there's a lot of big constraints that we've got and a lot of asks, I think, from the states and territories. So there's always tension in that relationship, but when we can get it right, and Jacinta and I have known each other for, oh gosh, I don't know, over nearly 30 years now, I think. And I can say the same with pretty much all of the infrastructure ministers across the country. We've all been around in politics for a long time. You know, those relationships are important, but there is always a necessary and healthy tension in that. My job's to, you know, make sure that we protect the Commonwealth's taxpayer investments and our budget and all of those, and Jacinta's got to do the same to try and get the best deal she possibly can for the state, and you'll sometimes see that play out with our leaders on front pages of newspapers on various occasions, but that cooperation is incredibly important to actually deliver projects.
There's another area of cooperation I think is incredibly important, and that's between government and, you know, a number of the players that we have in this room. And at last year's conference, there was a lot of conversation about how do we bring the expertise in the private sector earlier into conversations about publicly funded infrastructure. And the Productivity Commission brought down their 5-year review just very recently, and one of their recommendations is just that, to involve contractors earlier in planning and scoping through the use of alliance contracting, collaborative contracting for major projects, and thinking about, you know, how you build incentives into contracts right from the early stages. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about that particular recommendation and steps you might be taking in that direction.
I think it depends on the nature of the project particularly. I think there are some that lend themselves really well to having that very early involvement and, you know, in the design, and you know, we often see with those projects that, you know, they're less, they're de-risked in terms of some of the overruns and some of the challenges that you have, but it really depends on the project. And again, you know, we're dependent on the states and territories who really are the tender of the contract, enter into those contracts, but we are open to, you know, how our investment, how our national partnership agreements with states and territories can facilitate that and develop that. I think there's a lot of discussion about, you know, trying to de-risk projects, trying to look at how risk sharing is actually undertaken. But, you know, both Jacinta and I, at the end of the day, we want to, you know, we want to make sure we get the best value for the money that we're putting in, and that we actually deliver these projects, you know, on time and on our budgets as best as we possibly can. And sometimes, you know, sometimes projects will lend themselves to that, but it will really depend on the project in itself.
Yeah, okay, no, thank you. And you talked about economic security and, you know, building capacity in this country, and you talked about TAFE, and I know that's very close to your heart, very close to mine as well. My father spent his career in that sector. But we have a question which says, yes, this is an important thing to do, and you'll know where this is going. Given the time to competency for new trainees and apprentices, where does migration fit in, and how are you going with that conversation?
Look, it will always be part of the picture in this country. I think that's the acknowledged reality of it. There's, you know, obviously we have recognised, particularly in this year, that because of the significant labour shortages, that migration's probably going to have to do a bit more of the heavy lifting than we would normally expect. We obviously saw a lot of people leave the country. We're not seeing, we actually, surprisingly, I'm surprised the students are all coming back. They're coming back really strongly in terms of numbers, but in terms of skilled workforce, we are now competing. The Inflation Act in the US is going to be a massive driver of both, you know, material skills, and that's going to be really challenging, I think, globally as well. So we've got to be competitive. You will hear Claire O'Neill in the not too distant future talk. She's spoken about it, but we'll actually have some announcements to make around the whole way migration operates in this country in terms of the labour and capacity, but also the sort of future of that. But I think one of the legacies we've really learnt from COVID is that we also have to become far more resilient and sovereign in that resiliency as well, whether it's from workforce or the things that we make here. It's why the 180,000 fee-free TAFE, trying to move that cost as a barrier for anyone entering trades, but also the National Reconstruction Fund, which is sitting, I think it hasn't gone to the Senate, it might have gone to the Senate now, is incredibly important for building that manufacturing resilience and sovereignty in this nation. Thank you.
I've been given the 1 minute wind up, which I think is a bit rich, because by my calculations, we've still got 2 minutes to go. Is there anything you wanted to tell us that I didn't give you a chance to get out yet?
No, I think that is that's most of it. I mean, I do want to say, you know, like I think particularly, you know, on the decarbonisation, I think we've got an incredible opportunity. You know, we're a bit behind where I think many of us would like to be. Industry's been really leading the way on this. But things, you know, one of the things I discovered in my department, you would think, given the contribution that transport makes to emissions, you would think, like I was surprised when I got there, I said, well, you know, who's doing the work within my department about how we help the transport sector decarbonise? there was no one unit. So we've set up a unit now that's our net zero unit to really focus and work on transport and put us heading that up, a good Victorian. So there's a lot for us to do. We are rebuilding the capacity of a public service that has not had that particular focus for a decade, and we really welcome industry partnering with us on that journey.
And there's people in this room that would like to see a fuel efficiency standard for light vehicles, and that would be no surprise to you. Minister, thank you so much for your usual clear comments.
Lovely. Thank you so much for having me this morning.